Breaking news this hour, the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that Russian fighter planes have conducted their first airstrikes against ISIL positions in Syria. And that's after the Russian president was given the go-ahead by Russian lawmakers.
The only way to combat terrorism in Syria and in neighboring countries is to act preventatively, to destroy the terrorists on the territories that they've already captured. Soviet countries are already fighting alongside Islamic State. If they succeed in Syria, they'll inevitably return to their home countries, including Russia. Russia has always supported and still supports the fight against terrorism. But we are sure that this fight should be conducted according to international law.
Now, the Pentagon has confirmed that the Russian military notified the U.S. it was starting its air operation. RT's Lisa Phelan is in the Syrian capital, Damascus.
This is huge news. The first Russian Air Force strikes against Islamic State targets in Syria confirmed. The Russian Defense Ministry says that they've carried out airstrikes against Islamic State's communication centers, arms, vehicle, and fuel depots. Now, of course, this comes after a request by the Syrian government, whose army has been fighting for almost 5 years against anti-government militants, including the Islamic State. They're extremely stretched across many different fronts. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry stresses that there's no ground troops involved in this operation, that it is limited to airstrikes.
It's about using Russia's air forces in Syria. The use of the army on the ground is out of the question, that's according to the Russian president.
All of this comes as these anti-government militants, including the Islamic State, continue to wage a fierce battle against the Syrian government. In fact, just under an hour ago, I saw 2 mortars land very close to my hotel in the heart of Damascus, illustrating how the Syrian army is fighting across many different fronts. Now, these mortar attacks on Damascus are a daily occurrence, and the Syrian army is having to grapple with these attacks in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Homs, on various different fronts. And people that I've been speaking to over the last month of being here are extremely fed up of having to deal with these attacks. Of course, many of those people, particularly in a city like Damascus, have friends and relatives who are fighting in the army or in pro-government militias against groups like the Islamic State. In fact, just a couple of days ago, as the Russian President Vladimir Putin was addressing the United Nations General Assembly, I spoke to a few Damascenes about how they feel about this ongoing war and what this potential for Russian involvement means for them.
It's very important for the Syrian people that Russia have this role, because after 5 years of war, and everybody knows the results of this international war, has to play the role to get this war to the end, because everybody is tired, and Russia knows very well from their history and from the history of any war, they know the results.
All people in Damascus thought Russia is a very important country to end this war, because it's enough.
So many people really hoping that this Russian involvement will mean that finally the tide will turn in this conflict, and that they will finally see a decisive pushback of terrorists like the Islamic State, and hopefully, ultimately, their defeat.
Now, Russia's moving into Syria after a year of U.S.-led airstrikes proved to be of little help in fighting Islamic State. During the time, the group has grown in size and influence, while ISIL-inspired attacks have been taking place across the world.
Исламское государство нацеливается на господство в исламском мире. И не только там. Только этими планами явно не ограничиваются.
Now, Russia's plan to fight against ISIL in Syria was raised during the meeting of Russia's president with his American counterpart this week. No specific arrangements were revealed, but both countries acknowledge they have common grounds in the battle against terrorists. And targeting terror is a major topic of discussion at today's meeting of the UN Security Council. Well, let's get more details now from RT's Igor Piskunov. So, Igor, do tell us what Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had to say. Bring us some highlights of his speech.
Well, Foreign Minister Lavrov, of course, focused on commenting Islamic State now that Russia is getting involved into this, and he explained that, well, once again, the main purpose of this operation is combating extremism, but he did stress that you cannot combat terrorism in a country without getting the country's legitimate authorities involved in the process. He says that previous experience shows that ignoring the authorities in that sense just doesn't lead to any positive results. Sergei Lavrov is also calling for all sides interested in combating Islamic State to join Russia in this operation, but under the format of having to involve the Syrian authorities in the process. We know that this has been discussed between Presidents Putin and Obama during the General Assembly. Lavrov and Kerry discussed these things as well, and perhaps the country's approach towards Assad and his government is the biggest difference in their policies, but things, frankly, do change and opinions change. In fact, here's an example of how the Western approach to Assad changed.
Can't continue to double down on a strategy that's doomed to failure.
You need to have conversations with people, and you need to find the common ground.
Russia has been calling for the establishment of a joint coalition in the fight against Islamic State, and I think, well, that is very likely to be one of the main issues raised at the Security Council as well.
All right, Igor, thanks for bringing us this update from New York. Igor Piskunov there. And let's get now more reaction from Mike Hookham, the UK Independence Party's defense spokesperson. Thanks so much, Mike, for joining us here on RT International. Well, Russia is now battling ISIL in Syria. So what are your thoughts on this move? I mean, is it a good thing that another military power is joining the fight?
Well, I mean, I'm not happy with what Putin's been doing in the Ukraine, but I'm very happy that now Mr. Putin's going to be taking the lead in the fight against the Daesh, the ISIL, and it's what I've been calling for quite a few months now, that it should be a grand coalition led by some of the oil-rich Arab nations to fight against Daesh, and it seems this is the way Mr. Putin's thinking.
Okay, but how much of a game changer is this for the war in Syria already?
Well, I think it's a big game changer. I mean, we've now got a superpower willing to stand up and say enough is enough and to fight against Daesh.
And many countries, including Iran, Latvia, and China, we have been monitoring the reaction there, have welcomed the move. But what about Britain? What reaction do you expect in your country?
Well, I would hope they would get on board. As I say, I've been asking for a coalition between NATO, the NATO forces, America, Russia, China, all of these countries to get involved and to fight, which is I believe, one of the greatest threats to Western civilization. ISIL, Daesh, we'll call them whatever you may, and to fight these people and to destroy them.
Well, China earlier pledged to help Syria if a request for aid was received. What kind of help are we talking about here? Would Beijing consider sending in warplanes? What do you think?
Well, I think, you know, again, Putin will be sending in warplanes, will be sending bombing missions. America's already sending bombing missions. We're sending in bombing missions, Great Britain. And it should be ground forces led by the oil-rich Arab nations in there to defeat Daesh and to get in there and really to send a signal that enough is enough and we've had enough of these people.
Well, earlier, Sergei Lavrov spoke at the UN Security Council meeting, emphasizing the fact that it's important to have a comprehensive strategy and joint efforts in the fight against ISIS. Well, the U.S. is already waging its own air campaign there. Should we expect joint efforts here, and how will that pan out? What are your thoughts here? Briefly, if you could.
Well, I would hope America would look at what Putin's doing and get on board with what he's doing and join forces and you know, let's defeat these people, let's get rid of them.
All right, Mike Hugum, the UK Independence Party defense spokesperson, thanks so much for talking to us here on RT International.
Thank you very much.
Well, just a couple of weeks ago, the Pentagon was left red-faced as it admitted only 4 or 5 U.S.-trained rebels remained on the ground fighting Islamic State in Syria.
Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking 4 or 5. So.
Is it still the goal to have about 12,000 of them there? Is that still the goal? What's the expectation then for them?
At the pace we're going, we won't reach the goal that we had initially established for ourselves. But the overall goal is to make sure that we have enough mass to be able to get work done on the ground.
Meanwhile, the Pentagon says the latest batch of so-called moderate Syrian rebels, it trained and armed, have handed their equipment over to an al-Qaeda-linked group. The U.S. vetted militants gave the al-Nusra Front 6 pickup trucks and ammunition. The hardware accounted for 1/4 of what the Pentagon supplied. What's more, just days earlier, up to 70 of the U.S. trainees reportedly defected to the extremists, along with more weapons provided by America. Now, special advisor to the UN Security Secretary General believes Washington should realize that fighting Assad and ISIL simultaneously is not an option.
So much ideology. In the United States, the U.S. government said 4 years ago, Assad must go. So it's almost a matter of pride. Oh, he must go, otherwise we didn't succeed. 4 years later, it's ridiculous that we're still on the same line, actually. Syria is a threat to everybody, and everybody shares the common interest in agreeing to stop that incredible violence of the Islamic State extremists. Everybody should agree on that. Very pragmatic. And that should unite all of the countries in the region, also Russia and the United States. Enough of the higher political disputes. Let's get practical. And President Putin said that, and I agree with him on that. The idea that the U.S. would overthrow the Assad government and fight ISIS makes no sense. And that's a lot of why we have this chaos right now, because the U.S. is trying to fight 2 wars, and they're in 2 completely different directions, and the result is awful. 0. In fact, the U.S. spent $500 million and trained almost nobody. So it's a kind of, you'd say it was absurd, but it's tragic. It's not absurd. It's absolutely tragic, the mistakes that have been made, and I think the U.S. has made a lot of them. And I believe that President Putin is correct that attacking the Syrian government and saying we're going to attack that and try to fight ISIS isn't working at all.